Good afternoon from Bioversity International, and thank you for joining our talk on agricultural biodiversity and our planet. My name is Emil Frison. I'm the Director General of Bioversity International, or Bioversity for short. Bioversity is one of 15 member research centers of the CGIAR, working to improve the food-secure world for the future. Bioversity is studying the use and conservation of agricultural biodiversity to improve smallholders' livelihoods, nutrition, and the sustainability of their production system. We have more than 100 scientists spread all over the world in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And we have been, just in the last 5 years, working in over 100 developing countries to provide solutions, working with partners to support practical change in communities. This week, there is an important global discussion going on, and this dialogue is part of a global conference called Planet Under Pressure, in which Bioversity International and other CGIAR centers are following and participating in. The issues being discussed in Planet Under Pressure are the very issues that Bioversity International is working on every day. For the next 45 minutes, we will be talking more about the dialogue that will take place here in this live discussions on agricultural biodiversity. And I'm joined here by our colleagues, Dr. Bruce Cogill, the leader of our Nutrition and Marketing Diversity Program, Dr. Fabrice de Klerk, the leader of our Agroecological Intensification and Risk Management Program, and Dr. Stefan Weise, our Deputy Director General for Research. The talk will be moderated by our communications team, which is gathering inputs from you, from our website and social media, so that we can hear from you and interact with you. To initiate our dialogue, I'd like to tell you about a farmer whose life has improved as a result of our work. Mr. Adhikari is a smallholder farmer and plant breeder in Nepal. This farmer was facing economic hardship and had sold most of his land to pay for his wife's medical treatment. After working with our partners, he began to use more agricultural biodiversity in his farming. He bred new crop varieties and planted combinations of crops that enriched the soil. He recovered land that others called worthless. He found new opportunities. Most importantly, Mr. Adhikari is still farming today and sharing his knowledge with his community. Agricultural biodiversity is essential for our future. It's a resource to improve systems from farm to fork. We need to take an integrated food systems approach to simultaneously improve the livelihoods and nutrition of smallholders, and also to make their production system more resilient and sustainable. This is vital as we look at relieving our planet under pressure. During our talk today, you will learn more about our work and our vision for the future, but we also look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for tuning into the discussion today. Just a reminder, you can comment directly on the web screen. You may join the discussion on Twitter via our hashtag ABDchat, or you're welcome to comment on our Facebook page. Any way you choose to engage with us, we welcome the dialogue. Also, please remember to identify yourself and your organization if possible. We will try to respond to all questions during the talk or afterwards. Our first question that has come in is for Dr. de Klerk. Dr. de Klerk, what are the key issues facing food production for our planet today?
So thanks for joining us for this conversation. Some of the key issues I think are very well highlighted by Foley's paper published in Nature in November just last year. And I think the key issues there really are looking at how we're going to be able to produce enough food for 9 billion people by 2050. but doing it in ways that we did differently over the past 50 years. I think we recognize increasingly that agriculture has been largely responsible for several critical planetary pressures. The loss of biodiversity, for example, has been tremendously affected by agricultural production. Water production, 70% of global water resources are used by agriculture. 30% of greenhouse gases come from agriculture. So we're really faced with this dual challenge of trying to understand how we produce more food, but at the same time reversing the impacts of agriculture on these land use systems. And I think agriculture, more than trying to reduce its footprint, needs to seek a new vision where we really become much more multifunctional. That is, how do we produce landscapes that don't degrade the environment, but rather contribute to improving the environment. Systems that improve soils, that increase water quality and quantity, that protect biodiversity and make use of that biodiversity. And I think this is a tremendous dual challenge that we have.
Thank you very much. Dr. Frizon, this question has come in from News on Green. I understand what biodiversity means, but please explain in layman's terms why that is important for climate adaptation.
Well, we know that climates are changing and we will need to have crops that are adapted to the new climate. So we need the diversity for the breeding efforts of the future. But probably what is most important is what faces us already today. The visible changes that are already impacting farmers is a greater frequency, greater intensity of extreme events such as droughts, increased extreme temperatures, floods. And farmers don't know what will come in any given season. And therefore, they use common sense. They don't put all their eggs in the same basket. They use more agricultural biodiversity in order to minimize the risk linked to these extreme events that are becoming more frequent as a result of climate change.
Emil, this reminds me of a quote I saw a while back that biodiversity is the life insurance of life itself. I think captures that concept well, that when you're unsure what disasters or what situation might be in the future, that using biodiversity is a way of assuring or having that insurance that you'll be able to keep producing, keep providing for your family in the long term. So really for many of the smallholder farmers we work with, it really is a life insurance policy.
Yeah.
This next question has come in from our website. Dr. Kogel, could you address this one? What about nutrition and agricultural biodiversity for women and children, especially in developing countries?
Yes, thank you for that question. And when we think about a planet under pressure and we talk about agrobiodiversity, we have to think of it in terms of human terms. And I think no better example than that of the burden that falls on women and children in a planet that is not able to feed itself. Certainly in that 1 billion people that go to bed each night hungry. Those data from FAO really remind us of where the costs of poverty, of inequity, and I think most notably now with habitat loss, with lack of diversity, this impacts on health and nutrition. And I think in the research that's been done by Bioversity as well as others, we know that there's a relationship between dietary diversity and dietary quality. Dietary quality translates directly into the kinds of statistics that we all see that really shows up in children under the age of 5 and even more so in children under 2 years of age. So I think it's important to address biodiversity as a precursor for a quality diet, and that is along with good health care, along with information, education, as a basis for getting rid of malnutrition, getting rid of hunger. I think that's something that all of us can agree to, both here at Bioversity, but also in others that are working on these issues.
And relating to this, why is it so important to support smallholder farmers? Dr. Weisse, could you address that, please?
Sure. Smallholder farmers are not rare. I mean, we have 2 billion smallholder farm or people living in smallholding or smallholder farm households, a substantial part of the global population. So it's important that we acknowledge that, recognize that. Also important to understand, which often we don't really figure out is or get to know, is that 60% of the global food production is actually produced by smallholder farmers. So again, smallholder farmers are there. They're important from that perspective. At the same time, they live often in poverty. And so it is important for us to be able to address the poverty issue, to look at opportunities to improve the income generating options that they have, to improve the productivity of their farms and their livelihoods through that. But at the same time, by doing that, because of their numbers, we're also contributing to global food security, what was addressed earlier in terms of the numbers of people we will be needing to feed in 50 years from now. So again, the smallholder farmers have a critical role to play, and we need to recognize that. And finally, they're custodians of agricultural biodiversity, and it's important that that this is again recognized because the farmers are managing the landscapes in which they do the farming. They are managing the crops, the diversity of crops that they work with. And again, it becomes very important, that linkage between the agricultural biodiversity use, but also the conservation aspect, which Emil was talking about. And so linked to that is, again, the forests. We tend to talk of crops and productivity, but at the same time, these landscapes do hold forests, and forests are an important source of income as well, and also of nutrition for the communities who live in these forest communities.
And if I can just jump in there, in the work that we're doing in sub-Saharan Africa, I'm struck by the numbers of smallholder farmers that are actually women. And not only are they the farmers themselves, they're also the caregivers and the major determinant of many of the decisions that affect their health and well-being.
Thanks. Dr. de Klerk, maybe you can respond to this question that has come in about the role that agricultural biodiversity plays in securing our sustainability, the future of our planet.
Sure, be happy to address that. So the way that we look at it as an ecologist is that we really look at the biodiversity as really being an integral functional component in these agricultural landscapes, and not just about the different types of crops that we're producing, but also recognize there are many associated species, the pollinating species, the pest control species, that all provide critical functions to these agricultural landscapes. And so when we think about conserving and using agrobiodiversity, we're really talking about a toolbox that's available to these smallholder farmers. When you reduce agrobiodiversity, it's like having a toolbox that just has a hammer, a screwdriver, and a wrench. You can do a lot of things with that. There's also a lot of things you can't do. When you conserve agrobiodiversity, it's having a whole set of screwdrivers, different sizes, Phillips heads, a whole sets of wrenches, saws, chisels, drills, and you really then are able to do much more within that landscape. And so protecting that toolbox, protecting its complementarity, or protecting its integrity, I think is really essential to make sure that these agricultural systems remain functional.
Dr. Weisse, speaking of research and the work we do here, how can laboratory success be transmitted to the small-scale farmers' fields?
Right. We often hear that research sort of gets stuck in the shelves or in the research stations. Oh, sorry. Apologies. We hear that research often gets stuck in research stations, and new knowledge gets stuck in shelves, and how do we get that out there? And I think important really is to be able to address the priority constraints and also priority opportunities of smallholder farmers. Right from the beginning, we have to involve them in the thinking, in the priorities in terms of the problems we want to address or need to address. At the same time, it's very important that we involve our clients in the work we do. So it's not just in terms of advising us as to what we should be working on as researchers, but also very much so in terms of working together with the farmers in partnership, in mutual partnership, to be able to start finding solutions together. And it's at these both levels where it is important that we involve our clients, the smallholder farmers, in these processes. And through that, we facilitate taking forward the type of work we do much more rapidly and make it more relevant to the smallholder farming communities. And so the uptake is going to be, and adoption is going to be much more feasible. And coming back to this question that Bruce brought up about the importance of women, I think we have to recognize also, depending on which communities we work in, it's often easier to access the men in these communities as we as researchers go in, whether we are men researchers or female researchers. But the key point there is that women play a critical role in agriculture, in smallholder agriculture, And so we have to find ways of working with women as well as we address these issues. After all, 80% of the food in Africa is produced by women farmers, 60% in Asia. So again, very important that we keep this in mind and make our work relevant in terms of adoption and take-up at the end of the day.
One other dimension that relates to that is to move away from what I would call the pipeline approach to where you do some research in an advanced lab and then test it out on an experimental farm and then pass it on through advisory services to a farmer that is then told, here is a technology package, apply it, to the notion of really co-development and systems of innovation that are jointly owned by the farmers and the researchers, and where we really have a marriage between traditional knowledge and modern science. And I think this participatory approach is really a way forward that will ensure not only that the research that is conducted and the results that are produced are more relevant, but are also going to be adopted much more widely and in a more durable and sustainable way.
I think that the participatory element is really important, as you mentioned, Stefan. We've been doing some work with Nicaraguan farmers, looking at the traits of trees in pastures, trying to diversify the number of species used in these pastures. And what we realized is that when we look at the local knowledge, that is what the farmers know about the trees, and then the ecological knowledge, what we can measure about their contribution to services, that there's a very strong overlap between those two different types of knowledge. And the gender aspects, I think, are also quite interesting in that there's really quite complementary knowledge that's maintained by the females in the households as well as the males in the households. The men tend to have a lot more information or knowledge about some of the production attributes. The women often are much more interested in some of the medicinal and nutritional attributes. I'm also reminded of a proposal that Jacob Van Etten just submitted, where they were looking at the traits in beans and trying to get farmers to help identify what the important traits were. And the male farmers typically, again, will go towards these production traits. And some of the traits that were of interest to the female farmers were how easily the beans can be hulled. So identifying the different roles that these genders are playing within household levels and incorporating those traits, I think, really provides a lot of very complementary information.
Similar, we talked about the relevancy of agricultural biodiversity. Dr. Frizon, can you speak about the value of agricultural biodiversity and how can that be worked out? This question has come from the Center for Ecological Services Management, Indian Institute of Forest Management.
Well, when we talk about value of agricultural biodiversity, traditionally it's been looked only at how it can contribute through breeding to increasing agricultural production. But as I mentioned already, for example, through the relevance to climate change and the role that diversity can play in making a production system more stable and more resilient, or the contribution that diversity is making to improving nutrition, those are aspects that today are externalities to agriculture. They are not taken into consideration. Also, the value of the crops are only considered in terms of the direct sales value, but the role and the value that is attributed to that diversity in terms of ecosystem services, whether they be relating to the ones you cited about water cycling or nutrient cycling, the pollination value, those are not taken into consideration now. And I think if we want to have a sustainable planet and a sustainable agricultural system, we must recognize the value that agricultural biodiversity has on all those dimensions.
We've talked about the value and the relevancy, but there might be some barriers to the adoption of it. Dr. de Klerk, would you talk about a little bit to our audience about the barriers to agrobiodiversity and why it has maybe not been adopted widely?
Certainly, I think there's a couple elements, some of the ones that Emile just alluded to. One is this notion of multifunctionality, and I think that over the past, we've really focused on the production functions in these agricultural systems at the expense of many of these other functions. And I think that when you begin to understand that an agricultural landscape, an agricultural system provides food, provides water, provides timber, provides fuel, provides all sorts of additional services, as begin increasing the number of services you want from these landscapes, the value of biodiversity goes up. So one element, I think, is this element of multifunctionality. The second element is that it's rather easy, if you will, to go to a farmer with a high-yielding variety of a species that's easy to sell in the market. It's much more difficult to sell diversity, if you will. And I think that we need to change the way that we think about biodiversity. And so it's really much more of an information-intensive type of system. So it's understanding how to manage information on biodiversity, which I think will help us to get past some of these barriers. We think that maybe biodiversity or agrobiodiversity means simply increasing the number of species within a field, but it really can go much further beyond that. It can be about how you range species within a landscape, or how you range species in field margins, where you place species within that landscape. And so we begin to understand the functional role that species play in these different elements. Then I think we'll begin to see much more progress at that. But I think it's moving beyond this notion that increasing agrobiodiversity is simply intercropping systems. It's much more, I think, understanding these fundamental relationships between biodiversity and function, what scale they operate at, and how to manage that biodiversity at these multiple scales. And I think with the very rapid rise of the information age, that we're just beginning to get the tools that will help us to harness that kind of an approach. So it's much more process-driven rather than a very targeted approach that we're used to in most agricultural interventions.
But I think as we do that, it is also important that we keep the bigger goals in mind. I mean, we have to do that towards achieving income generation, towards addressing the livelihoods issues, to addressing the nutritional aspects, to addressing the household equity issues. So I think it in itself, it is quite complex, but then we do have to keep it focused on being able to achieve those goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's where, you know, this idea that agrobiodiversity is simply polycultures maybe helps us get out of that a farmer can produce one variety that he knows he has market access to, but the conservation of the agrobiodiversity is maybe at the landscape scale. So it's ensuring that we have these genetic varieties within the landscape, that the farmers have access to the information about those varieties and access to those varieties to use them when appropriate, and to make sure that the markets are available for those varieties as well. So I completely agree, making sure that the use of agrobiodiversity contributes to income generation, whether it's through primary sale of crops or whether it's through the benefits of ecosystem services, including payments for ecosystem services. There's a variety of options that I think are coming online that can help ensure that these approaches are economically viable.
But I think one of the other probably barriers or reasons why there is not sufficient use being made of that is that it's much easier and including for the scientist to study a simple system of monoculture and to optimize the conditions to maximize the productivity in a simple system. It's much more complex to look at at the complexity of a smallholder farm that has many crops, many different varieties, the interactions between the different elements that you were describing. It can be mind-boggling trying to understand that complexity, and that's why I think we must take also different approaches, and coming back to this notion of not just the in-depth knowledge of one particular element, but the integration of what the farmer knows with what the scientist knows. And I think another aspect is that there's often a contradiction in views between people that say, well, diversity is part of the past, and if you want to maintain that, you want to hold people back into their poverty situations. And it must be clear that using more biodiversity is not about being romantic about the past and saying, you know, we want to keep things as they used to be in the past. It's about making a wise use of diversity, optimal use of that diversity, and that requires a deep understanding on both sides from farmers and from scientists. And I think it's that complexity that in itself is also a barrier.
But I think that it's actually the complexity that's the value of the diversity.
Absolutely.
And so it's having, you know, the insurance policy. The strength is that complexity, and that you have all these options available. There's a great story that has nothing to do with biodiversity of Kasparov versus the world. It's a chess game where you had actually the whole world playing against Kasparov, and the world almost won because they were able to draw on this very, very broad knowledge base. And so this diversity of information was made available, and they almost beat this chess grandmaster. So it's harnessing the information, harnessing the micro pieces, and being able to apply it in these things, I think, which will be critical. But I think complexity is the tool that biodiversity often provides.
And speaking of relating to this conversation, Dr. Kogel, could you talk a little bit about the nutrition and marketing aspects of the barriers and the value of biodiversity?
Listening to what you're saying about biodiversity, it actually applies to the human as well. We make choices among the foods we eat, but what we understand as far as the nutrient impact of, say, consuming a lot of vitamin C or having a meat-based diet, we understand often about the single nutrient and understand less about the interactions among nutrients. And so the modeling, the design of experiments or studies to understand what the combination of nutrients and the combination of foods. And I think the value of biodiversity and the analysis that Bioversity brings to it is looking at food and farming systems and having a better description of that, looking at where we can intervene or affect change to impact upon the measurable outcomes like survival, like child nutrition. These are ways of understanding and ultimately doing something about it. And I think that's what the focus is really what can we do to mitigate the issues that we're facing, to manage the risks, whether it be climate change, financial risks at a global or national scale, right down to studying the individual and understanding the diet and the role of nutrients in that diet is something that I think that will contribute to this ongoing dialogue, because we don't know the answers. We have some very interesting developments. You may have heard of the 1,000 days. They're focusing on pregnancy and under 2 years of age. It's a way to get the maximum impact on nutrition. But those approaches, combined with a better understanding of agricultural systems, of livelihoods, will give us the tools to do something about it.
But I think the nutrition issue also is a nice way to address this idea of complexity, because when we look at the nutrition journals or the weekly basis, what food's good for you or bad for you, it can be really mind-boggling. And then I think we have this very nice book by Michael Pollan, The Food Rules, which he says, if you can distill this complexity, it's just to eat your fruits and vegetables, just like our mothers told us. Eat your colors. So eat your diversity, and by eating or incorporating this complexity, you're covering all the bases. And that's a fairly simple strategy that incorporates this idea of complexity.
I think also with nutrition we have the same kind of barriers that we see in the use of agricultural biodiversity more in general, is that most of the investments that have been made in the past in nutrition have been what I would call taking a medical approach to fixing a problem that is already there. And also looking at often single nutrients. There's a vitamin A deficiency, so we bring in that particular element, or there's an iron deficiency, etc. And I think the whole approach of preventing these malnutrition single element from occurring is the real challenge for us. And doing that by having a more diverse diet is certainly the most sustainable way of achieving it. It is challenging, but I think that's the only sustainable way of addressing this problem of malnutrition.
Switching from food to forests now, Dr. Weisse, we've received a question regarding reforestation, and if you could talk a bit about how biodiversity plays a role in forests and how agricultural biodiversity in terms of forests is a key part of sustainability for the future.
Mike, yes. Next time I'm going to have the other one. No, the diversity the diversity in forest is very critical from a series of angles, both in terms of adaptation of forests to different environments, landscapes, but also in terms of use of those forests by communities that live around the landscapes in terms of food or in terms of medicinal uses. And therefore, the key is what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at where is that diversity that the forest folk are using and the forest dwellers are using. Where is that diversity that needs to be conserved? And how best do we do that in a way that it is not locking it away from use, but at the same time allowing the people who live in the communities around the forest that they can use it for their livelihoods. So it's trying to find a balance between use and conservation at the same time, and doing it there where it is relevant, so that we have to identify where these diversity hotspots are, so to say, and at the same time also see what the threats are to these to this diversity, so that we can address that at the same time, working together with the communities, conserving and using the diversity in the forests.
This question, Dr. Frizon, if you could take this one. What do you think of the Global Seed Vault, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault? And this has come from the Global Crop Diversity Trust.
Well, conservation of genetic resources, if we want to be able to use that diversity in the future, we must conserve it. And one way is to put that material into gene banks. But we know that gene banks, like anything else on this planet, can be vulnerable to fire, to floods, and we've had examples of that recently in different parts of the world. And therefore, the idea of having a safety backup somewhere near the North Pole in permafrost is a very important insurance. But we must not forget that it's an insurance, and like every insurance, you are willing to pay for it, but you hope that you will never benefit from that insurance in a way. So that and therefore that is not sufficient. Just having everything up there in the North Pole, while it is an important insurance, we must not forget that it's the use of that diversity that is going to make a difference. That will allow us to adapt to climate change, that will allow us to increase productivity and meet the food security and nutrition challenges. So we must really ensure that while we have this insurance, that we also invest in making use of that diversity and also allowing that diversity to continue to evolve in situ. And that's the part of our agenda on conservation that relates to providing conditions and ensuring that the diversity that exists today, which is not static, it doesn't stay as it is over long periods. It's adapting to changing environments, to new pests and diseases that develop. And I think a complementarity between ex situ conservation in gene banks and on-farm and in situ conservation in landscapes is very important because they play complementary roles.
We often forget that this negative interaction between pests and these species that drives the evolution of new varieties. And so even these negative interactions, something prey on the chili pepper is what leads to the flavor, or that the aspirin is an interaction between the willow and its herbivore, and on for many of the species that we want. So if we take them out of that context, we lose this adaptive, this very dynamic capacity, which I think is really critical to conserve.
There is another example on small millets in the Sahel area, where over time the rainfall patterns changed, and basically the rainy season became shorter and the dry seasons longer. And actually, we were able to observe, it wasn't our own work, but colleagues of ours who worked on this, another institution, who were able to find that after was it I think 30 years or 40 years, they were able to see a shift in the timing of flowering of the populations of the millet populations, and that this was genetically fixed, so it wasn't something that was transient. So there is this dynamic aspect, and I think as we talk of on-farm conservation, as you were saying, Emil, we need to keep in mind that when we talk of conservation, it's not just a static conservation where we are taking a plant and putting it away and conserving it for future use, but also that we need to maintain this dynamic evolution of populations in the field. And how do we do that best? Who do we need to work with? Where do we do it? I think those are all very critical research questions that need to be addressed.
We've received a question, if you'll bear with me. It's long, so I'm going to read through it. It's from the Center for Sustainable Agriculture, and any of you are welcome to respond. If agrobiodiversity is such a good thing, Why is it that there is a strong association between rural poverty and biodiverse landscapes? It seems that as people give up agrobiodiversity in favor of marketable varieties and as they reduce on-farm diversity, they most of the time improve their livelihoods, particularly their income. The poor are happy to trade off a loss of biodiversity for income. Would someone be able to address that question?
Well, the one dimension of that is that the question is often looked at only, we talked about the value of diversity in the past, and the only dimension that is taken into consideration here is the value of production. And of course, if farmers are only rewarded for the cash value they get from selling their produce, they will have one type of attitude. But if we take on the other functions, I think the response will be different. And I think maybe a second dimension is that all the efforts that have led to helping farmers change and improve their lives have been following a model of simplification. And I think there hasn't been really a sufficient investment in looking at ways to increase productivity while maintaining diversity. All the interventions that are taking place today still, and certainly in the past, have been focusing essentially on bringing in technologies that are accompanying simplification of the system. And I think that is also responsible for this continued correlation that you are mentioning. So it's not as simple as that. We cannot say that because a farming system is more diverse, people remain in poverty. I think it's the kind of interventions that are being put in place to address these issues that we have to look at.
And I think also to take the example of intercropping as a simplified example of diversification, there are millions of hectares of land in China that is now under intercropping. So it's not the monocropping, simple commodity approach that we seem to talk about often. And there are examples where a glutinous type of rice has been reintroduced that is valuable for the local population because they like eating that type of rice, that was attacked by a certain disease and they couldn't grow it profitably anymore. But by intercropping it with improved varieties, they were actually able to get good yields on the improved varieties as well as get the glutinous rice, which they prefer for certain types of food. So again, I think we have to be careful when we look at just a monocropping, simple commodity approach. I think we need to invest more into understanding the opportunities that there are in diversity, and that requires investment. We have maybe 50, 60 years of research investment on these simplified systems. Well, it's time we start shifting that investment to looking at these other opportunities that are provided through diversification.
And if I may jump in, we have a success story in the case of Malawi, which has managed to increase its production of maize and corn by focusing as a monoculture in that country. But over the last 10 years, while it's been a champion of the agricultural intensification community, it's failed in improving nutrition. Stunting rates are at 40%, in some areas 60% of children under the age of 5. And the government now recognizes that they need to have a diverse focus of their agricultural policy and are promoting intercropping. And we're very interested in looking at what the impact of that will be on poverty, but also on diets. And I think it's the recognition that in many parts of the world, developed countries as well as developing, dietary diversity at the high end is related very well to high-income populations, eat a diverse diet. But as you get to low-income populations, diversity decreases, but calorie consumption sometimes can go up and has other problems in developed countries. And in developing countries, the lack of dietary diversity is related to poor diet, and income is also at the same time very low. So I just want to make the case in support of agricultural biodiversity at a national level, but also at the individual or personal level.
I think this is a very nice example of where the cost reduction that we are trying to have in achieving greater efficiency in agriculture are actually being pushed to the health sector by increasing malnutrition, increasing ill health, as a result of a certain policy in agriculture. And I think you have to look at things in a more holistic way at the different sectors and look at what is also from economic point of view best for the whole system and not just one sector at the expense of the other sectors, whether it's the environment or the health sector.
Yeah, I would say that the health sector and the environment sector, as you say, also it means that we've been putting off that cost for a long time now. And I think the critical element here when we talk about biodiversity in agricultural landscapes is it's not a haphazard approach. It's not the same thing, as rustic coffee, which has a lot of forest benefits but very low economic benefits. But it's really understanding how agrobiodiversity works, what are the functions that are important to the farmers that we're working with, and where are the scenarios or situations in which agrobiodiversity can make a contribution to those functions. Is it clean water that we need? Is it stable water supply? Is it pollinators? Or are there important pests that can be managed by manipulating agrobiodiversity, either by putting barriers around different crops or by using these push-pull systems? So I think that the use of agrobiodiversity is going to require some very intelligent systems. And like Stefan says, I think that we need to invest in the research that helps us understand how we can harness that potential. And we're still a long ways from it, but it's very much needed.
Well, thank you all for your time today. That was our last question. We had time for the last question. I'd like to remind everyone that the recording and MP3 of this discussion will be available online approximately 3 hours after the event later today. Please continue to share comments and feedback with us, and we will try to respond to all questions. Thank you very much for tuning in, and Dr. Frizon has some closing comments for us.
Thank you indeed for tuning in our online discussion today. To contribute to providing global solutions, Bioversity International has set new strategic priorities and developed a new ambitious research agenda for the next 10 years. We have two main priorities to achieve our vision of a world in which smallholder farming communities are thriving and sustainable. Our first priority is to research the use of agricultural biodiversity by smallholder farmers with the potential to impact on 320 million people in smallholding communities in target areas through improved nutrition, through improved livelihoods, and a more resilient and sustainable production system. Our second priority is the conservation of plant genetic resources and plant diversity, and to ensure the greater availability of plant genetic resources so that the users can make more and better use of that diversity to provide sustainable farming solutions. In the next 5 years, Bioversity will be working hard to achieve our goals. We will be working with our partners in order to create the science and the knowledge that will be necessary to make a difference in smallholder farming communities. And we believe that agricultural biodiversity is essential to help our planet under pressure. I thank you all for your inputs and for the questions you have put to us. And we look forward to interacting with you through this social media and other media in the future. Thanks.